She stood at the gate like a statue trapped between leaving and staying her dress still bright white, despite the chaos of the morning, her hands trembling just enough to make the fabric ripple like waves in a storm. Her lips parted like she wanted to speak, but forgot how her eyes darted from the flight monitor to the boarding bridge back to the floor, and then to the door of the airplane where people kept disappearing, one by one swallowed into the narrow silver body of something that felt more like a metal coffin than a way forward. The woman next to her whispered something about how beautiful she looked, but the bride didn't respond, not because she was rude, but because her mind was so far away, caught in echoes of a memory that had never stopped screaming even when she learned to stay quiet. The groom stood behind her, tall, silent, steady, the kind of presence that didn't demand attention, but held it anyway. His hand hovered close to hers, not quite touching, not yet. He was waiting for her to breathe again, to return from wherever she had gone in her head. His eyes never left her face, not even when his phone buzzed again and again with messages from people waiting on the other side of the country, where a chapel had been decorated for hours with ribbons and roses, and people in pastel dresses wondering why the bride had not yet arrived. The gate agent called their row again, her voice pleasant, but slightly strained, and still the bride did not move, not even when a child tugged at her sleeve to ask if she was a princess, not even when the flight attendant waiting by the cabin door gave her a long look up and down, then rolled her eyes, and turned away as if to say, "Here we go, another scene, another delay." The bride took one small step forward, her heel catching slightly on the carpet, a sound so soft and quiet that no one noticed except the groom, who reached for her instinctively, but still said nothing. She looked back at him, and in that glance there was fear so deep it looked ancient, something rooted in the bones and blood, like the kind of fear that doesn't just live in the moment, but follows you from room to room across years and cities and lifetimes. The boarding line moved ahead without them, and the flight attendant checked her watch, her foot tapping just loud enough to be heard. The groom glanced at her, then back at the bride, and still waited, still silent, still calm. And all the while the bride kept watching the plane, watching the people vanish into it, like they were being pulled into something she could never escape from once she stepped inside. It wasn't the flight she feared, not exactly, not the turbulence, or the engine, or the altitude. It was the knowing, it was the history. It was that 5 years ago, almost to the day, she had watched a plane almost exactly like this one take off, with the man she loved on board. And she never saw him again, not alive, not whole, not returned, only in photographs and headlines, and one ring in a small plastic bag they gave back with eyes too soft to be comforting. And now she was here, wearing white, standing on the edge of something new, with the weight of something old crushing her lungs, and no one around her seemed to understand except the man at her side, who had chosen this date, this flight, this moment, because he believed some things must be faced to be released. The moment her foot touched the edge of the boarding bridge, something in her shifted, something small and invisible, but real like a thread, had snapped inside her, and now every step felt heavier than the last, like the air itself was pressing against her chest, and whispering warnings she had already heard before. She gripped the edge of the wall with one hand, her fingers pale against the silver surface, her breath coming short and sharp, and when the groom gently placed his hand on her back, she flinched, not because of him, but because of everything else, the way the plane hummed beneath their feet, the way the lights inside flickered like a heartbeat, the way the smell of cabin air brought back a flood of things she never asked to remember. The flight attendant stood near the entrance with a clipboard and a glance that said she had no patience for theatrics, her expression unreadable, until the bride hesitated again, blocking the line for the other passengers, who had now started to bunch up behind them, quietly impatient, but too polite to say anything just yet. With a long sigh, the attendant motioned for them to move forward, her eyes skimming over the wedding dress, the trembling hands, the pale face. She leaned toward another crew member and whispered something behind a forced smile and a practiced tone, the kind of voice used for crying babies or slow walkers, or people who forget how to board a plane. The bride turned slowly, her eyes meeting the attendant's for just a second, and what she saw there was not kindness or concern, but the flat stare of someone who had seen too much and cared too little, someone who had been trained to smile without feeling to comfort, without touching to dismiss, without guilt. She tried to speak, but no words came out, only a half-breath, and a soft sound like paper being torn. The groom gently guided her to their row third from the front aisle seats near the wing, and as she slid into her chair, her hands began to shake again, her fingers twitching against the armrest, like they were trying to find a rhythm to hold on to. The sound of other passengers taking their seats filled the space with rustling bags, low voices, overhead compartments clicking shut, and through it all the bride stared at the seatbelt in her lap, as if it might suddenly come alive and pull her under like an anchor tied to her past. The flight attendant walked by again, her heels clicking against the floor, her eyes lingering for a moment, then moving on, as if the bride were just another oddity in a long day of delays and rerouted connections. She passed out drinks and made announcements, but never looked back, not once, not until later. And as the engines rumbled to life, and the lights above flickered and dimmed, the groom leaned in and whispered something too quiet for anyone else to hear, something meant only for her, something that steadied her shoulders and stopped her hands, something that would change how everyone saw her once the truth was spoken out loud. The plane began to taxi down the runway, and the bride's heart raced in rhythm with the accelerating engines. Her grip on the armrest tightened until her fingers began to ache, the world outside the window blurring into streaks of grey and steel, and in her chest there was a weight too heavy to explain, a memory too sharp to ignore. Beside her, the groom remained calm, his hand placed gently over hers, still steady, still sure, but even his quiet presence couldn't stop the thoughts from swirling in her mind, the thought of him, the thought of what happened years ago, the thought of the life she never thought she would have to live without him. As the plane lifted off the ground, the pressure in her chest increased, a hollow feeling taking over, as if the plane were somehow drawing everything from her, at once taking all the air, all the control, all the certainty she had left in her life, and she closed her eyes for a second just to stop the spinning, just to find some kind of peace. But when she opened them again, the cabin felt like it was closing in, her breath shallow, her skin clammy and cold. The flight attendant walked past once more, this time her gaze sharper, her judgment heavier, as she looked down at the bride's trembling form. But instead of walking on like before, she stopped beside her seat, arms crossed, eyes scanning the bride's face, as if she were a problem to be fixed, something to be dealt with quickly and efficiently. But the bride didn't see her, she couldn't not, when every part of her was focused on the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The groom leaned closer, his voice soft yet firm, as he spoke her name, as if it were the only thing that mattered in the world. And for a moment everything else faded away, the flight attendant's gaze, the sound of the engines, the passengers around them, all of it was just a distant hum. He whispered again, asking if she was okay, if she was still with him, if she could feel the weight of the ground beneath her feet, just a little bit more every time the plane climbed higher into the sky. And for the first time since they boarded, she let herself breathe just a little deeper, just a little easier, and nodded once, her lips trembling, but a smile slowly forming, despite the fear that still gripped her heart. But before she could speak, the flight attendant cleared her throat loudly, as if trying to make her presence known once more. She asked if the bride needed anything, something to drink, or maybe a little more air, but her voice was sharp, too sharp for someone who was supposed to offer comfort, and the bride looked up at her for the first time, really looked at her, and saw something that surprised her. The flight attendant wasn't annoyed or irritated, she was scared of something she wasn't ready to face, something deep beneath the surface that she too kept hidden, and for a moment their eyes locked in a shared understanding. Something passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that they were both afraid of the same thing, just in different ways. But the moment was brief, and the attendant moved on her heels, kicking sharply against the floor. But for the bride, the brief connection was enough. It gave her strength enough to turn back to the groom and allow herself to lean into him just a little more, just enough to feel like she could survive this flight. The plane hummed through the clouds, a steady low roar that should have been comforting, but instead it felt like a warning, an endless reminder of how high they were, how far they were from the ground, and the bride couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to fall. She stared at the seatbelt in her lap, her fingers twisting the fabric, like it could somehow tether her to something solid, but it only seemed to slip through her hands like sand slipping away in the wind. Nothing she did could stop the spiraling thoughts that raced through her mind, or the memories that kept returning again and again, like waves crashing against a shore. Beside her, the groom remained calm, his hand never leaving hers, but she could feel the weight of his concern in the way he looked at her, in the way his brow furrowed when she winced every time. The plane shifted in the air. His voice was low but steady when he spoke, telling her they were safe, that nothing was going to happen, that she was with him, and that they were going to make it through this flight, just like they had made it through everything else. But the words felt hollow in her ears. They didn't reach the part of her that was still terrified, that part of her that had never really healed from the day her first fiancé had stepped onto a plane and never returned. Her breath caught in her throat again, and for a split second she couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, couldn't even think, as the memories hit her all at once like a tidal wave, dragging her under. She closed her eyes, hoping it would stop, but the images kept flooding her mind, the flashing lights, the sirens, the cold night air, the news reports, the unanswered phone calls, the empty seat at the table for holidays that would never be the same. She grabbed his hand tighter this time and squeezed her eyes still shut, her heart racing, her thoughts wild, her chest tightening with the familiar weight of grief, the kind of grief that doesn't just vanish. When time passes, it stays with you. It follows you into every new moment, and it clings to every new relationship. And no matter how hard you try to outrun it, it finds its way back. The groom noticed the change in her, the way her body stiffened, the way her breath quickened, and he leaned in closer, his voice almost a whisper, as he asked if she was okay, if she needed something, anything. But she couldn't answer, not with words, not with anything that would make sense, not in that moment, when everything inside her was screaming, and the outside world seemed so far away. And then the flight attendant appeared again, walking down the aisle, this time slower, her eyes catching the bride's for just a moment, but there was no judgment in her gaze, no impatience, no rolling of her eyes, just a small shift in the air, like something had changed, something unspoken between them. She paused just long enough to ask if the bride needed assistance, if she needed a drink, or to step out of the cabin for a moment, but the bride couldn't look at her, she couldn't face her, and with a slight nod the attendant moved on, but not before the bride caught something in her eyes, something like regret, something like understanding. The bride leaned back in her seat for a moment and closed her eyes again, focusing on the sound of the plane, the soft rhythm of its movements, the feeling of the groom's hand in hers. And for the first time since boarding, she didn't feel completely alone, even though the fear still gnawed at her. The bond between them was enough to keep her grounded, enough to keep her from falling apart. The plane cut through the clouds with a soft shudder, and the bride felt it deep inside her, like a warning from the past, something that echoed in her bones and made her stomach tighten. She kept her eyes closed, but the image of the plane, the image of the other flight so long ago, kept replaying in her mind over and over again, like a film she couldn't stop watching, even though every frame brought her closer to the edge of something dark and unforgiving. Beside her, the groom shifted in his seat, just enough for her to feel the warmth of his body close to hers, but it wasn't enough to quiet the storm inside her, the storm that had started the moment they stepped onto the plane, and refused to let her go, no matter how much she tried to breathe, no matter how much she tried to think of something else, something safer. She felt his hand on her arm, now soft, and steady his voice low as he whispered her name once again. But this time there was something different in his tone, something deeper, something more urgent. And when she turned to face him, his eyes were full of something she hadn't seen before, a kind of understanding that she didn't know how to respond to not yet. He spoke quietly, but firmly, telling her that he knew what she was feeling, what she was holding on to, but that he wasn't going anywhere. He told her that she didn't have to carry the weight of the past anymore, that they didn't have to live in the shadow of what happened before, and that whatever happened on this flight, whatever fears she had, didn't have to control her anymore. The bride opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat like they always did. When she tried to speak about it, the truth about her first fiancé, the crash, the years of silence, the endless waiting for news that never came, she had never told him, the full story, never told anyone how deep the wound went, how it had shaped every decision she had made since then, every relationship she had built since then, every step she took since then, always haunted by the possibility of history repeating itself. The plane shifted again, a small jolt that felt like the earth had moved beneath them, and she gripped the armrest harder, her knuckles white, her breath shallow. But before she could sink back into the fear, the groom squeezed her hand gently, his voice breaking through the panic in her chest, telling her that he knew the whole story, that he had known from the beginning, but that he hadn't wanted to force her to speak about it before she was ready. And that was when the truth hit her like a wave crashing into the shore. All at once, the weight of the secret she had kept buried for so long, the weight of the love she had never fully allowed herself to let go, of the guilt that had kept her locked in place for years. She had never spoken the words aloud, not even to him. But now they were there, hanging in the air between them, and she couldn't take them back. She turned to face him fully now, the tears finally spilling over the edge of her eyes, her voice cracking as she whispered the words she had kept silent for so long, the words that had stayed buried deep inside her until now. And as she spoke them aloud for the first time in years, something shifted inside her, something that made her feel like she could finally breathe again, like she could finally let go. The groom listened without interrupting, his face soft with understanding, and the weight of the moment heavy in the air around them. And in that instant the plane seemed to disappear, the noise of the engines, the hum of the cabin, everything faded into the background, as if the world had slowed down just for them. The confession hung in the air between them like a fragile thread, one that could snap with the slightest shift in the wind. The bride's heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment it felt like everything she had ever kept locked away was spilling out of her all at once, all the grief, all the fear, all the doubt she had carried for so long. It was too much to hold inside, but now that it was out, it was impossible to take back. The groom remained still beside her, his hand still holding hers, but his touch felt different now. It wasn't just comfort, it wasn't just the steady presence he had always been, it was something deeper, something more vulnerable, as if in that moment they were both exposed in the rawest way possible, and there was no going back from it. She looked at him, her voice still shaking as she spoke the words that she had never dared to say before, the words that had been locked behind the door of her heart for years, words she had kept hidden from everyone, even him, the words about the crash, about the loss, about the fear of history repeating itself, about how she had never fully allowed herself to trust again, because of what had happened to him, what had been taken from her. The groom listened without a single word of judgment, his eyes never leaving her face, his grip on her hand tightening just slightly, as if to reassure her that it was okay, that she was safe now, that she didn't have to carry the weight of the past alone anymore. For a long time she didn't speak. She just let the silence settle between them like a blanket wrapping around them both, and for the first time in a long, while she didn't feel the need to fill it with anything, she didn't feel the need to explain herself or apologize or make excuses for the way she had been so guarded, so afraid. But then she felt the shift in the air around them, the way the cabin seemed to calm, the hum of the engines softened just a little, as if the plane itself was recognizing the change inside her, the way the tension that had been building between them for so long seemed to ease. Just a little bit, the weight on her chest lightened for the first time in years, and she realized that she had been holding her breath for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to exhale. She turned to him again, this time with a steadying breath and a soft smile, a smile that had been missing for so long, a smile that spoke of the first step in letting go of the past, of allowing herself to move forward, of believing that maybe, just maybe, she could find peace in the future she was about to build with him. The groom's face softened in return, and in that moment, the noise of the cabin, the whispers of the other passengers, the constant hum of the engines, all faded away, leaving only the two of them together in that fragile moment of understanding and release. But just as she felt the weight of it all start to lift, just as she felt the calm begin to settle over her, the plane jolted slightly, a sudden shift that threw her back into her seat, her eyes snapping open, and her hand instinctively gripping his even tighter, her heart racing again as the sudden movement brought the old fear rushing back in the familiar panic, the same panic that had stayed with her all this time, the panic that always returned whenever she thought she could finally breathe. And before she could stop herself, she whispered to him again, her voice urgent, her grip tightening. But this time it was different. This time she wasn't just afraid of what had happened. Before, she was afraid of losing him. She was afraid of what she had just shared with him, what she had just allowed herself to feel, because now it felt too real, too vulnerable, and that scared her more than anything else. The plane settled back into its rhythm after the jolt, but for the bride it felt like the ground beneath her had been ripped away, and for a brief moment she was suspended in the air, between the past and the present, between fear and hope, between what she had been and what she could become. Her heart pounded like a drum in her chest, and her breath came fast, as if the air itself had become too thick to breathe. She glanced at the groom, but his face was calm, still steady, still there, and in that moment she knew he was all she had left in this world. But the fear, the raw panic, still gnawed at her, the fear that whatever she had just allowed herself to feel, whatever she had just revealed, would be ripped away by the harshness of reality. And she wouldn't know how to survive it. She couldn't let herself go there again. She couldn't let herself believe in something that might not be real. The groom's hand was still over hers, but this time it felt different. It felt like a lifeline, like something that could pull her back from the edge of the abyss. She felt herself teetering on. She turned toward him again and saw the quiet concern in his eyes, the same concern she had seen in his face from the moment they met. But now it was heavier, more real, more full of weight. And she realized that he wasn't just concerned for her, he was worried about her, the way you worry about someone who is drowning and can't even recognize that they are. And she couldn't handle it anymore, the weight of it, the weight of all the emotions she had been carrying for so long, the secrets, the fear, the guilt, the grief she had locked away so tightly that she had forgotten what it felt like to let anything out, to be free of it for even a moment. And now it was all spilling over her like a flood she couldn't stop. And she hated it. She hated how weak it made her feel, how vulnerable, how exposed. Her eyes filled with tears again. But this time it wasn't just the fear, it wasn't just the panic. It was the exhaustion of holding it all together for so long, the exhaustion of pretending she wasn't broken, pretending that she could just move on from everything that had happened, from the trauma that had shaped her, every thought, every action, every decision in her life. The groom gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had started to spill over. His voice was soft but firm as he told her again that she didn't have to carry it alone, that he was with her, he would always be with her. And at this moment, this flight, this fear, it was just one step in a bigger journey, one that they would take together, no matter what came next, and that nothing could change that. But the bride couldn't speak, not yet. She couldn't find the words to match the overwhelming emotions swirling inside her, so instead, she let her eyes speak the truth, her hands tightening around his as if to anchor herself to the reality of his promise, to the safety of his presence. She looked around the cabin at the other passengers, who seemed to be completely unaware of the internal storm raging inside her, and for a fleeting moment she wondered how many of them were carrying their own secrets, how many of them had their own fears and doubts hidden behind the calm faces and polite smiles. And then it hit her that maybe everyone had something they were hiding, something they were running from. And maybe that was why it was so hard to trust that anyone could truly understand her pain. But just as the weight of that realization began to settle in her chest, the flight attendant appeared once more, her heels kicking against the floor, this time her eyes softer, more knowing than before. She paused beside their seat, and for a long moment she just looked at them, her gaze lingering before she spoke, her voice quiet and understanding, as she asked if everything was okay, if the bride needed anything, as she wanted to talk. But the bride shook her head, not because she didn't need help, but because the words were too hard to say. The words were still stuck in her throat, and maybe they always would be. The cabin fell into a hushed silence after the flight attendant spoke, and for a moment it felt like time had stopped. The noise of the engines, the soft murmur of other passengers, all faded into the background, leaving only the bride, the groom, and the quiet weight of the world pressing down on her chest. She still couldn't speak the words she wanted to say, the ones that had been building inside her for years. But they were no longer needed, not right now, because in this moment she realized something important, something that she had never allowed herself to fully accept before. She didn't have to say everything to be understood. She didn't have to be perfect. She didn't have to hold it all together anymore, because he was there beside her, not because he had to be, but because he chose to be, and that made all the difference in the world. His hand, still holding her, still steady, still warm, and she knew in that moment that the fear, the pain, the uncertainty could no longer control her, not if she let go and allowed herself to trust him the way he had trusted her from the very beginning. The plane continued to glide through the sky, but it felt different now. It felt less like a prison and more like a path forward, a journey, not just to a destination, but towards something more profound, toward healing, toward acceptance, and toward the possibility of a future where the past no longer had the power to define them. The bride finally took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling as the tension inside her began to ease, and for the first time in so long she felt the weight of her grief lift just a little bit. She leaned her head against the window, her eyes closing as the cool glass pressed against her temple, and the steady rhythm of the plane beneath her became a lullaby, a gentle reminder that she was safe, she was here, and she was no longer alone. Beside her, the groom's voice broke through the silence once again, this time filled with a quiet confidence, as he told her that they had made it through this flight together, that they could make it through anything together, no matter how difficult, no matter how uncertain the road ahead might be. And in that moment she knew he was right. The future didn't have to be scary, it didn't have to be something to fear, not when she had him beside her. The flight attendant passed by them once more, and this time there was no harshness in her gaze, no judgment, no impatience, just a soft smile, a fleeting moment of connection, as if she too had witnessed something in that quiet exchange, something that reminded her that sometimes the strongest thing we can do is to simply be there for someone else, even when we don't have all the answers. The bride turned to the groom, her voice finally steady as she whispered, "Thank you," just the simple words, but they held everything she couldn't say before everything that had been building inside her for years. And the groom squeezed her hand, in response his smile warm and reassuring, and in that moment she realized that this flight was more than just a journey from one place to another. It was a turning point, a moment where everything had changed for the better. And as the plane soared higher into the sky, she allowed herself to breathe deeply again, to trust that the future was waiting for them, and that they would face it together. The sound of the engines was a comfort now, the rhythm of the flight a steady pulse beneath them. And as the plane continued its journey through the clouds, she felt a sense of peace wash over her, the kind of peace that only comes when you finally allow yourself to let go of the fear and embrace the possibility of something beautiful, something real, something that had always been there waiting for her all along.